December 8, 1941. The morning sky over Clark Field in the Philippines shimmered with heat when the first wave of Japanese aircraft appeared, their engines droning with a menacing precision. At first glance, American defenders thought they were facing familiar Nakajima bombers, but sweeping above and around them, cutting arcs of impossible tightness, were the long-winged fighters that would soon terrify every Allied pilot in the Pacific. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero. To the Americans on the ground and in the air, the first encounters felt unreal. The Zero seemed to float and twist with an agility that violated every law of aviation physics they knew. U.S. Army Air Force's pursuit pilots in P-40 Warhawks, already scrambling late after the surprise attack at Pearl Harbor, discovered that their trusted aircraft could neither turn inside nor climb with these pale, nimble fighters. By the end of the day, Japanese pilots claimed dozens of American aircraft destroyed. On the ground, whole squadrons of B-17 and P-40 Zeros burned on the tarmac. The Zero's design had been a gamble by the Imperial Japanese Navy's engineers at Mitsubishi. In pursuit of range and maneuverability, they stripped weight wherever possible. No armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, paper-thin skin stretched over its frame. What emerged was an aircraft of extraordinary lightness, a fighter that could outturn anything in the sky and fly ranges unthinkable to its opponents. With a 1,560-mile radius, the Zero could escort bombers across vast Pacific distances where American fighters would have long run dry. By the first months of 1942, the Zero had become legend. In Malaya, British Hurricane and Buffalo squadrons were mauled, their veteran pilots stunned by how quickly the Japanese machines outclimbed and outmaneuvered them. In the Dutch East Indies, Allied defenders reported entire formations being shredded in minutes. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 further confirmed the impression. Japanese carrier fighters slashed into American strike groups, and even when losses were traded, American pilots admitted privately in after-action debriefs that they felt overmatched. Captured diaries from Japanese aviators, later translated by Allied intelligence, revealed the depth of this confidence. A lieutenant of the 3rd Air Group wrote in January 1942, "The American machines are heavy and sluggish. They dive fast, but when we turn they cannot follow. We play with them before the kill." Another pilot, based out of Rabaul, described how American P-39s spun like toys when pressed into turning contests. The Zero's long wings and responsive controls gave Japanese flyers the illusion of absolute mastery, a belief that bled into propaganda films and training lectures, reinforcing the myth of invincibility. For the Americans, official reports painted a bleaker picture. An Air Force Historical Research Agency summary of early 1942 recorded loss ratios that bordered on the catastrophic. In some encounters, U.S. fighters were destroyed at rates of 5-1. One after-action report from the Philippines, preserved in the National Archives, concluded bluntly, "The enemy aircraft demonstrate performance superior in all respects, save protection." Standard defensive tactics are inadequate. Engagements at equal altitude result consistently in the loss of friendly aircraft. The sense of despair filtered through letters home. A young pursuit pilot, writing from Australia after surviving the fall of Java, told his family, "They can fly circles around us. We cannot fight them. Our only chance is to run." And yet, running was not always an option. The Zero's range meant that it appeared where no fighter should logically be able to. Over Port Moresby, over the vast reaches of the Indian Ocean, even escorting bombers deep into Burma, the long-legged Japanese fighter gave Allied commanders the impression of a machine that defied geography itself. This psychological edge compounded its battlefield results. Pilots approached combat with the expectation of defeat, and expectation has a way of creating its own reality. In the first half of 1942, the Allies lost the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, and Burma. The Zero became the cutting edge of Japan's expanding empire. its silhouette etched into the minds of defenders as a symbol of doom. But myths rarely last unchallenged. By mid-1942, cracks had begun to show. Some US pilots, forced into desperate improvisation, discovered survivable methods of fighting. A handful of combat reports noted that while the Zero could outturn and outclimb at low speeds, it could not withstand steep, high-speed dives. The lightweight frame that gave it agility also made it fragile at terminal velocities. A Warhawk diving vertically could escape pursuit if the pilot had altitude to trade. This tactical adaptation found its most famous advocate in General Chennault, leading the American volunteer group in China. His pilots, flying the underpowered P-40, were instructed never to dogfight. "Dive, shoot, and zoom away," Chennault told them. Against the Zero, turning was death. Only speed offered survival. And as the Solomons campaign opened in mid-1942, American pilots put these lessons into practice. They began to climb before engagements, to avoid being caught low and slow. They trained to make slashing attacks, using hit-and-run methods that minimized the Zero's turning advantage. Though losses continued, kill ratios began to narrow. At Coral Sea, at Midway, and in the skies over Guadalcanal, the Zero still scored heavily, but it no longer operated in a vacuum of superiority. A post-war Japanese officer, interrogated in 1946, admitted candidly, "We believed at first that our Zero could not be challenged. Then, slowly, the enemy learned. We began to see our comrades fall in greater numbers. The surprise was gone. By the end of 1942, the Zero remained a formidable machine, but it was no longer untouchable. New American designs, tougher, faster, better armed, were entering service. The Corsair and the Hellcat, not yet fully blooded in combat, loomed on the horizon. For the first time, Japanese pilots sensed that the heavens might not remain theirs forever. The myth had been born in fire and triumph. But even myths, once questioned, begin to fade. The sound of warplanes in the Pacific was already familiar by the spring of 1942. For months, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero had dominated skies from Malaya to the Coral Sea, carving a reputation that seemed almost supernatural. Yet quietly, far from the reach of Japanese reconnaissance, an American answer was being forged in the factories of Connecticut and California. Its name was the Chance Vought F4U Corsair, and its first appearances in the Pacific would mark the beginning of a dramatic reversal in air power. The Corsair was unlike anything the Pacific skies had yet seen. With its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, producing more than 2,000 horsepower, it was capable of speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. Engineers designed its iconic inverted gull wings to house the enormous propeller that engine demanded. Naval aviation historians later wrote that its very silhouette gave the impression of a predator folding its talons before striking. Yet in early 1942, before a single Corsair flew in combat, doubts persisted. Some US Navy officers saw the plane as too advanced, too fast, even too dangerous for carrier operations. Early landing trials were riddled with disaster. Its long nose obstructed pilot vision on approach, and the aircraft's bounce on touchdown caused costly accidents. The Navy hesitated. For a time, the Corsair seemed destined to remain a land-based fighter, its true potential unseen. But marine aviators, already hardened by the desperate defense of Guadalcanal, saw something different. "We didn't care if it was rough to land," recalled Marine pilot Ken Walsh years later. "We wanted something that could climb, dive, and hit harder than anything the Japanese had." The Marines would be the first to unleash the Corsair in battle. By late 1942, Guadalcanal had become the crucible of air power in the Pacific. The Japanese sought relentlessly to bomb Henderson Field into submission, while American Wildcats and P-400 Airacobras clawed the sky in desperate defense. Pilots still spoke of the Zero in tones of fear. It could climb like a rocket and turn inside you before you knew what happened, one 339th Fighter Squadron report noted. The men fighting over the island knew the legend firsthand. Then, in early 1943, the Corsair arrived. Marine Squadrons VMF 124 and VMF 213, operating from Espiritu Santo and Guadalcanal, began flying the bent-wing fighters in combat patrols. Their entry was dramatic. On February 13, 1943, a formation of Corsairs clashed with Japanese Zeros over the Solomons. In the fight that followed, Corsairs claimed multiple kills without a single loss, a startling result for men who had grown accustomed to paying dearly for every victory. One after-action report from 13th Fighter Command recorded the reaction of Japanese pilots. Captured diaries later confirmed it. The enemy was stunned. A blue fighter appeared, larger and faster than any Grumman, wrote Petty Officer 2nd Class Matsuo, a Zero pilot whose notes were recovered after the war. It came from below, climbing like a demon. Our formations scattered, surprised by its speed. The Corsair's sudden appearance struck not just at Japanese planes, but at the psyche of their aviators. For more than a year they had been told, and had believed, that the Zero was without rival. Its legendary maneuverability had humbled Americans across the Pacific. Yet here was a machine that could not only meet the Zero, but, in some dimensions, exceed it. Testimony from captured Japanese officers after the war underscored the impact. One naval lieutenant, interrogated in 1946, admitted, "We believed the Zero could always escape by climbing. But the new American fighter, Corsair I think, could follow us higher. That was a shock to our confidence." The once unchallenged path to altitude superiority was gone. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey interviews later documented similar findings. Pilots who once relied on zoom and climb tactics against heavier American aircraft suddenly found themselves pursued relentlessly. It was as if the physics of battle had changed overnight. The numbers told part of the story. The Corsair's climb rate exceeded 3,000 feet per minute, while the Zero struggled past 2,600. At altitudes above 20,000 feet, where American bombers increasingly operated, the Corsair held a decisive edge. Its heavy armament, 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, delivered devastating firepower. The Zero's lightly built frame, without armor or self-sealing tanks, proved tragically vulnerable. But statistics could not capture what pilots felt in the cockpit. Ken Walsh, who would become the first Corsair ace, described his first encounters with Japanese fighters. "They expected me to level out or stall in the climb. Instead, I pulled above them, rolled over, and came down with my guns blazing. They never saw that before." The Corsair did not erase American losses overnight. Pilots still needed training, and the Zero remained deadly in skilled hands. But the tide was perceptibly shifting. Each engagement chipped away at the myth of invincibility. By March 1943, 13th Fighter Command intelligence officers began intercepting Japanese communications, noting new blue planes in the Solomons. Reports described American aircraft that climbed higher and faster than the Grumman, and advised caution in direct combat. Naval intelligence filed these with interest. It was the first time Japanese pilots themselves admitted that their aerial supremacy was slipping. A 339th Squadron debrief on April 1, 1943, recorded one Corsair pilot's words. "The Zeros came head-on, then tried to spiral up. I stayed with them. They broke away, something I've never seen before." For the first time, American aviators could dictate the terms of an engagement, forcing Japanese fighters into defensive maneuvers. By the spring of 1943, the Pacific skies had changed. The Zero still claimed victories, and Japanese aces continued to score kills with deadly precision. Yet whispers of doubt spread among them. The Corsair was unlike anything they had faced. It could climb higher, accelerate faster, and deliver crushing firepower from ranges the Zero struggled to match. The myth of Japanese aerial invincibility had already begun to fracture in 1942. With the arrival of the Corsair, those cracks widened. What once seemed impossible, turning the tide of the Pacific Air War, was suddenly within reach. The skies over the Solomon Islands were already infamous by early 1943. Day after day, Japanese Zeros of the 204th and 253rd Kokutai clashed with American fighters in brutal, swirling dogfights. Both sides understood the stakes. Control of the air over the Solomons meant control of supply lines, airfields, and ultimately the momentum of the entire Pacific War. Into this cauldron, the Corsair now flew in earnest. Its debut was no longer an isolated incident. By the spring of 1943, it was becoming a defining presence in the battles for the islands. On March 28, 1943, Marine Fighting Squadron 124, VMF 124, staged one of the earliest large-scale Corsair operations over the Central Solomons. 12 bent-wing fighters lifted from Guadalcanal's battered Henderson Field, their blue-grey fuselages gleaming under the tropical sun. Their target, Japanese positions near Kahili Airfield on Bougainville, a stronghold heavily defended by the experienced pilots of the Imperial Navy. The engagement that followed was recorded in detail by 13th Fighter Command debriefing officers. At 14,000 feet, the Marine Corsairs intercepted a force of approximately 20 Zeros. The Zeros dove aggressively, their pilots still confident in the reputation of their aircraft. But what happened next was different from anything they had experienced before. Second Lieutenant Archie Donahue recalled, "They came down on us in the usual way, expecting us to scatter. Instead, we climbed into them. They didn't expect that. I got above 2 of them and cut loose. The first one flamed, and the second rolled over, trailing smoke. By the end of the fight, Marine pilots claimed 6 Zeros destroyed for the loss of 1 Corsair. The claims were later revised, but even Japanese records confirm the impact. 3 pilots from the 204th Kokutai failed to return. The Corsair had held its own in a full-scale clash, and the men who flew it knew they were facing a new era. Captured documents after the war provide a rare glimpse into Japanese reactions. The war diary of the 204th Air Group, recovered on Bougainville in late 1944, noted with unease. Enemy fighters of new type encountered. They climb strongly and do not lose speed in upward turn. Care must be taken not to contest climb with them. For men who had grown used to dictating altitude advantage, this was a jarring admission. Interrogations of surviving Japanese pilots in 1946 confirmed that the first sustained contacts with the Corsair shook morale. "We did not know this fighter," one officer explained. "At first we believed it was only another Grumman, but it was not. It was faster in climb. Our formations broke apart." Among the early Marine Corsair pilots was Captain Kenneth A. Walsh, a man whose name would soon become synonymous with the bent-wing fighter. Walsh flew with VMF 124 and quickly discovered the Corsair's strengths. He preferred to fight Zeros by using altitude, climbing above and then diving in. In April 1943, Walsh scored his first Corsair victories over the Solomons. His combat report described a telling pattern. Zeros attempted to spiral climb to escape. I was able to maintain position and fire bursts from 300 yards. 1 Zero caught fire and dove vertically. Another tried to turn but could not evade. By the summer of 1943, Walsh would be credited with over a dozen kills, becoming the first Corsair ace and earning the Medal of Honor for his exploits. His victories were not just personal. They were living proof to other Marine pilots that the Zero was no longer untouchable. Reports from Allied coast watchers, those lonely outposts manned by Australians and Solomon Islanders behind enemy lines, also began to note a change. Where once Zeros swept confidently over the islands, by mid-1943, sightings revealed tighter Japanese formations and more cautious tactics. They lingered less over Henderson Field, avoided long chases, and broke off combat sooner. An April 1943 report from Coast Watcher Donald Kennedy recorded, "Japanese fighters now appear wary of engaging American patrols at altitude. Their willingness to press attacks on shipping is reduced, the presence of new US fighters suspected as the cause. For men on the ground, it was a subtle but telling shift. For months they had endured almost unchecked Zero dominance. Now they saw hesitation creeping in. The Corsairs' arrival did not mean instant victory. American pilots still faced harsh lessons. Those who tried to turn tightly with Zeros often paid with their lives. The Corsair could not match the Zero in a flat turn, one 13th Fighter Command officer bluntly noted. Those who attempted it did not return. Instead, new tactics evolved. Marine pilots adopted what they called boom and zoom methods, using superior speed and climb to strike from above, then diving away before the Zeros could counter. It was a mirror image of what Japanese pilots had once done to slower US Wildcats and P-40S. Now the roles were reversed. By June 1943, 13th Fighter Command intelligence summaries emphasized, Corsair pilots are to avoid prolonged turning combat, use dive and climb. In these regimes, the Corsair has advantage. The advice was not theoretical. It was born from blood and fire in the skies over New Georgia and Bougainville. Through the summer of 1943, American kill claims climbed steadily. VMF 124 and VMF 213 reported dozens of victories against Japanese aircraft, though wartime claims often exceeded post-war verified totals. The US Strategic Bombing Survey, cross-referencing Japanese records, later confirmed significant losses by the 204th and 253rd Kokutai during this period, losses they could ill afford. At the same time, Corsair attrition remained heavy from combat and operational accidents. Its unforgiving carrier landing characteristics still meant that the Marines bore the brunt of its early use. Yet despite the challenges, the effect on the air war was unmistakable. By mid-1943, Japanese air groups that once dominated now struggled to maintain parity. In 1962, during a US-Japanese aviation history symposium, surviving Japanese pilots spoke candidly about their first encounters with the Corsair. Commander Saburo Shindo recalled, "The Grumman we knew. It was slower, more clumsy. The Corsair was a shock. It was fast and could climb higher. Our young pilots were unprepared for this. Many did not return." On the American side, veterans like Archie Donahue described the same period with quiet satisfaction. "We'd been on the defensive for so long," he explained during a 1985 veterans reunion in Hawaii. But once we had the Corsair, you could feel it. The balance was tipping. We weren't just surviving anymore, we were winning. By the end of 1943, the myth of the Zero had been permanently broken in the Solomons. The Corsair's first full year of combat had proven it could climb higher, accelerate faster, and hit harder than the once invincible Japanese fighter. Zeros were still dangerous, and skilled Japanese aces remained formidable opponents. But the shock was real. Their enemy had fielded an aircraft that matched and often surpassed them. The Pacific skies, once the domain of the rising sun, were no longer uncontested. The Corsair had arrived, and the balance of the air war was shifting decisively toward the Allies. The fall of 1943 marked a turning point in the Pacific. With Guadalcanal secure, American forces advanced toward Bougainville, a sprawling jungle island whose airfields would place Rabaul, the great Japanese bastion, within striking distance. For the Marines and Army troops landing there in November, survival depended on one factor: air superiority, and it was the Corsair that would bear much of that burden. On November 1, 1943, US Marines stormed ashore at Empress Augusta Bay. Overhead, waves of Corsairs from VMF 214, VMF 215, and other Marine squadrons orbited, ready to intercept Japanese aircraft expected from Rabaul. Their job was simple in description, brutal in execution: keep the skies clear. They did not have to wait long. Within hours, Japanese bombers escorted by dozens of Zeros appeared, racing down from the north. The first great air battle over Bougainville had begun. Marine pilot Pappy Boyington, then with VMF 214, the famed Black Sheep, later recalled the chaos. "We were outnumbered, no question about it, but the Corsair could climb with them. We came in from above, dove through the formation and lit them up. The Zeros scattered, but they weren't used to Americans chasing them straight up. The clash ended with heavy losses for both sides. Japanese records show at least 15 fighters and bombers destroyed, though US pilots claimed far more. The Marines lost several Corsairs, but the landings below proceeded unmolested. For the first time in the Solomons campaign, an amphibious operation had succeeded without crippling aerial interference. Bougainville forced the Japanese to commit everything they had. From Rabaul, elite air groups of the 11th Air Fleet flew daily missions to disrupt the American beachhead. They still believed the Zero could carry the fight, but every engagement revealed the growing reality: their legendary fighter was being matched and outpaced. A captured diary of a Japanese petty officer, later translated by Allied intelligence, contained a telling passage dated November 8, 1943. "The new American fighter with bent wings is very strong. We cannot outclimb it. In diving, it is hopeless to follow. Only in turning are we still superior, but few of them will turn with us." It was a stark admission. The battlefield truths pilots whispered among themselves, even if their commanders would not. Combat reports from the 13th Fighter Command describe a pattern that repeated itself throughout November. Zeros would attempt to intercept Corsair patrols, only to find themselves outmaneuvered in vertical fighting. Marine pilots increasingly dictated altitude, forcing the Japanese into defensive spirals. One report from November 11th details Captain Henry Bourgeois' combat near Torokina. Engaged 4 Zeros at 15,000 feet, climbed into them, maintained advantage, fired bursts into lead aircraft, observed explosion. Others attempted to break downward, pursued and destroyed one. Remaining 2 disengaged. By the end of the Bougainville campaign, Corsair pilots claimed dozens of Japanese aircraft. Even after post-war corrections, the toll on Japanese air power was significant. The 253rd Kokutai, once a terror over the Solomons, saw its veteran cadre whittled away. The impact was more than material. It was psychological. For months, Japanese pilots had accepted that the Zero was supreme. Now, day after day, they faced a fighter that could climb higher, dive faster, and absorb punishment in ways their fragile aircraft could not. In a 1946 interrogation, former Zero pilot Lieutenant Yoshio Fukui admitted, "At Bougainville, we lost many good men. The enemy's new fighters were fast and very strong. Our tactics were no longer enough. It was the first time I felt the war turning against us." For the Americans, the effect was the opposite. After years of surviving under Zero dominance, Corsair squadrons felt an intoxicating sense of parity. They no longer dreaded the daily scramble alerts. Instead, they welcomed them. It wasn't that the Zero stopped being dangerous, one VMF 214 pilot recalled decades later. It's that we finally had the machine to meet it head-on. By December, the skies over Bougainville were firmly in American hands. Japanese raids dwindled in frequency and intensity. The Corsairs' performance, paired with the relentless arrival of new squadrons, had turned the island into an Allied stronghold. The myth of the Zero had been bleeding since 1942, but Bougainville made it undeniable. Even Japanese commanders, in after-action reports captured later, conceded that enemy fighters of new type contest our operations at all altitudes. Losses are serious. For the Marines on the ground, that meant survival. For the Japanese, it meant the erosion of the last illusion of air dominance in the South Pacific. By the end of 1943, the Corsair was no longer an untested newcomer. It was battle-proven, feared by its enemies, and loved by its pilots. At Bougainville, it had demonstrated that the Americans not only had an answer to the Zero, but a weapon that surpassed it. The bent-wing bird had arrived, and the Japanese knew it. By the opening weeks of 1944, the Japanese bastion of Rabaul loomed as the final fortress of their South Pacific empire. Once the hub of offensive operations, its sprawling airfields and massive harbour had become a defensive citadel, bristling with anti-aircraft guns and guarded by hundreds of fighters. To crack Rabaul meant breaking the last shield over the Bismarck archipelago and clearing the path to the Philippines. For the Americans, it was not just a strategic target. Rabaul was the crucible in which their new fighters, Corsairs and Hellcats, would prove beyond doubt that Japanese air power no longer ruled the Pacific. Rabaul's defences were legendary. By late 1943, the Japanese 11th Air Fleet had concentrated more than 250 aircraft there, including veteran Zero units reinforced by twin-engine bombers. The geography itself favoured the defenders, a massive volcanic caldera opening onto Simpson Harbour, surrounded by airstrips at Lakunai, Guadalcanal and Tobera. American planners understood what they were up against. "We were looking at the most heavily defended base outside the Japanese home islands," one 13th Fighter Command officer later remarked. To hit Rabaul was to go into the lion's den. But by February 1944, the lion was already wounded. The bloody attrition of Guadalcanal and Bougainville had thinned Japanese ranks. Fuel shortages, inexperienced replacement pilots, and mounting mechanical failures all weakened their once formidable strength. Yet the psychological aura of Rabaul remained, and for both sides, the coming battles would test not just machines, but morale. On February 19, 1944, Marine Corsairs of VMF 213 and VMF 214 launched from Bougainville to escort B-24 Liberators on one of the largest raids yet against Rabaul. They flew into dense formations of Zeros rising to meet them. The clash, later detailed in 13th Fighter Command reports, was savage. Captain Kenneth Walsh, already an ace, described the fight. "They came at us in disciplined groups, 3 and 4 at a time. We were climbing at full throttle, and for the first time, they could not shake us. I rolled over and went down through them, set one afire, then pulled up into another." The Corsair never faltered. Marine pilots claimed 20 kills that day, though Japanese records confirm closer to 10. Still, the significance was unmistakable. The Americans had driven into the very heart of the Zero stronghold and emerged with the upper hand. A Japanese after-action report captured later by Allied forces admitted the shock. Enemy fighters pressed attacks at high altitude with great strength. Zero fighters could not maintain superiority. Many losses sustained. At Rabaul, the Zero's weaknesses became glaring. American bombers now operated at altitudes over 20,000 feet, and the Corsair's powerful R-2800 engine allowed it to climb and intercept there. Zeros strained and often failed to reach those heights in time. Marine pilots adapted quickly. They no longer needed to fear tight-turn dogfights. Instead, they dictated battle on vertical planes. Corsairs dove onto Zeros, raked them with heavy .50 caliber fire, then zoomed back up before the Japanese could respond. It was a brutal inversion of the tactics the Zero had once used against Wildcats. Veteran pilot Pappy Boyington of VMF 214 recalled in his memoirs, "They couldn't get away from us anymore. Before, they'd just climb out, and you couldn't follow. Now we followed, and we caught them. You could feel their surprise in the way they broke off." Interrogations after the war provide a haunting counterpoint. Lieutenant Hideo Oishi, a Zero pilot who flew over Rabaul in early 1944, told Allied officers in 1946, The Corsair was terrifying in climb and firepower. We could still turn inside it, but they no longer tried. They used altitude. When we saw them above us, many of our young pilots panicked. A Japanese staff officer at Rabaul added bluntly, "We were fighting machines we could not match with pilots we could not replace." The acknowledgement was painful but undeniable. The Zero had reached the limits of its design, while American fighters only grew stronger. The sustained air campaign against Rabaul through early 1944 broke Japanese air power there. Carrier strikes by US Navy Hellcats, combined with Marine Corsair sweeps devastated airfields and destroyed scores of parked aircraft. By March, Japanese commanders were forced to withdraw most surviving fighters to Truk, effectively conceding the skies. The US Strategic Bombing Survey later concluded, the destruction of the Rabaul air arm marked the end of organized Japanese aerial resistance in the South Pacific. Losses could not be replaced, and morale among surviving pilots collapsed. Corsair units recorded dozens of victories during this campaign. Even after adjusting inflated claims, Japanese records confirm catastrophic losses, over 150 fighters destroyed in the opening months of 1944. Perhaps the most profound impact of Rabaul was psychological. For nearly 2 years, the Zero had been a weapon of terror. Pilots feared its climb, its range, its agility. But over Rabaul, the aura shattered. Reports from both sides show Japanese aviators increasingly hesitant, breaking away from combat earlier, abandoning bomber formations to save themselves. At a 1962 US-Japanese aviation symposium, former Zero pilot Saburo Sakai reflected, "At Rabaul, we realized the Zero was no longer supreme. The new American fighters, especially the Corsair, were too strong. Many young pilots went into battle already believing they would not return." On the American side, Corsair veterans remembered Rabaul as the moment they knew the tide had irrevocably turned. "That was when the fear disappeared," said one Marine pilot at a 1985 veterans reunion. "We still respected the Zero, but we no longer dreaded it." By the spring of 1944, the Corsair had done more than contest the Zero. It had surpassed it. Rabaul was left isolated, bypassed in the Allied advance, its airfield silent. From there, the bent-wing fighter would accompany the island-hopping campaigns through the Marshalls, Marianas, and Philippines, carrying its reputation as the whistling death into every battle. The Zero was not finished. It would still claim lives, still fight bravely in the hands of skilled men. But its days of dominance were over. In the crucible of Rabaul, the legend of the Zero met the reality of modern American air power, and it did not survive. On the morning of June 30th, 1943, the humid air over the Solomon Islands shimmered with the heat of another relentless campaign. Operation Cartwheel, the Allied push to neutralize Rabaul, was underway, and the skies above New Georgia became the proving ground for a new kind of duel. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero, still revered in Tokyo press dispatches as the Emperor's heavenly arrow, would come face-to-face with the Vought F4U Corsair, the bent-wing brute now flown in increasing numbers by Marine and Navy squadrons. For the first time, the contest would not be fought on myth, but on performance. By mid-1943, Japanese aviators in the Solomons were veterans of 2 years of continuous combat. The pilots of the 204th and 253rd Air Groups, many hardened since Pearl Harbor, carried reputations that inspired awe among younger recruits. Yet attrition gnawed at them. Diaries captured by US intelligence and later translated by ATIS reveal a tone of weariness. One entry, written in May 1943 by Lieutenant Saburo Tanaka, reads, "Our skill is unmatched, but our machines feel tired. The Zero has carried us far, but the Americans are growing stronger. The skies are no longer empty for us." For American flyers, that growing strength was embodied in the Corsair. The first operational squadrons, Marine Fighting Squadron 124, VMF 124, and VMF 213, had introduced the type in early 1943. Its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine delivered 2,000 horsepower, nearly double the Zero's Sakai engine. Its gull-wing design, once mocked in hangars, gave it space for the huge propeller that converted horsepower into brute thrust. The Solomons offered no sanctuary. Whoever controlled the skies determined whether convoys lived or died, whether airfields functioned or fell silent. Thus, both Zero and Corsair pilots found themselves locked into a brutal grind, scrambling daily, bleeding men and machines into the humid jungle and restless sea. On July 1st, 1943, the first clear reports emerged of Corsairs tangling with Zeros over New Georgia. A 13th Fighter Command debrief recorded the words of Captain Archie Donahue, a Marine ace with VMF 112. We climbed to 25,000 feet, expecting the Zeros to follow us into the vertical, but they stalled out long before reaching us. One of them tried to spiral up, but the Corsair just kept going. At altitude, the fight belonged to us. For the Japanese, this was a shock. Up to that point, they had relied on the Zero's climb rate and agility to dictate the flow of engagements. In 1942, Wildcats and P-30s could rarely challenge them above 20,000 feet. Now the Corsair could rocket past 30,000 feet and still maneuver. Sergeant Masao Tsuji of the 253rd Air Group recalled in a 1945 interrogation, "We believed no American plane could climb as we did, but the bent-wing fighter rose higher. It was like watching a heavy bird that should not fly, yet it climbed into the clouds and left us below." The summer of 1943 saw relentless air battles across Rendova, Munda, and the waters of Kula Gulf. Records from the 13th Fighter Command note 437 combat sorties by Corsair units in July alone. Zeros remained present in force, flying from bases at Kahili, Balale, and Buin. One clash on July 15th illustrates the shifting tide. Marine Corsairs from VMF 124 intercepted a formation of 20 Zeros escorting bombers toward Rendova. Major William Millington led the Marines, climbing hard into the sun. At 26,000 feet, they slashed downward in a boom and zoom attack. 3 Zeros fell in the opening pass. After-action reports show only 2 Corsairs lost, both to flak, not enemy fighters. Post-mission notes recorded a tone of incredulity. The enemy cannot follow us in the vertical. Their turns remain sharp, but the initiative is ours. We dive and climb as we please. They no longer dictate the fight. For Japanese pilots accustomed to circling duels where their light touch on the stick spelled victory, this was deeply unsettling. The Zero's once prized agility was now a liability. A Corsair pilot who refused to turn and instead used speed could not be caught. Japanese officers recognized the danger. An August 1943 entry in the 204th Air Group War Diary, later captured and translated, noted, "The new American fighter has great power. It can climb to heights where our engines falter. In the dive, it is like a hawk upon sparrows. To turn tightly remains our only hope, but the enemy no longer accepts the challenge." Interrogations conducted after the war confirm this perception. Lieutenant Commander Masatake Okumiya, later co-author of Zero, stated bluntly, "By 1943, the Zero was overmatched. We still fought bravely, but our machine could not keep pace with the Corsair. It was like using an old sword against a rifle." American intelligence noticed the shift as well. A Naval Aviation Intelligence summary from October 1943 read, "Enemy fighters continue aggressive tactics, but the introduction of F4U units has neutralized the Zero's altitude advantage. Engagements above 25,000 feet consistently favor the Corsair." Yet to call the Zero obsolete in 1943 would be misleading. In skilled hands, it remained lethal. Marine pilots learned this the hard way when overconfident green flyers tried to turn fight at low altitude. Reports from Guadalcanal hospitals list dozens of young Corsair pilots shot down after ignoring the golden rule: never dogfight a Zero in the horizontal plane. Captain Kenneth Walsh of VMF 124, who would later receive the Medal of Honor, put it best in his post-war memoir. The Zero was still dangerous, always dangerous. If you forgot that for even a moment, it could kill you. But with discipline, the Corsair gave us the edge. We had to fight our way, not theirs. On the Japanese side, younger pilots arriving from the homeland began to sense the changing balance. Letters from Ensign Hiroshi Fujita, recovered from his effects after he was shot down in August 1943, capture the emotion. We are told the Zero is supreme, yet the enemy's blue-winged fighter climbs into the heavens while we struggle. Our hearts are strong, but the sky has betrayed us. Strategic implications. The duel over the Solomons was more than a contest of aircraft. It was a reflection of industrial momentum. The Zero had been designed in 1939 for a nation that expected short wars and rapid victories. The Corsair, entering service in 1943, represented a United States that could outbuild and out-engineer any rival. By September 1943, Corsair squadrons were flying from every major Allied airstrip in the South Pacific. Combined with the rising presence of P-38s and improved Wildcats, the Zero found itself increasingly outnumbered and outperformed. The transition was gradual, not sudden, but the encounters above the Solomons marked the first sustained period in which Japanese pilots realized their opponents' machines could climb higher and faster, and that their dominance of the sky was ending. By late 1943, the myth of the Zero had begun to crack irrevocably. Over the steaming jungles and turbulent waters of the Solomons, Marine Corsair pilots proved that agility alone could no longer guarantee victory. The Japanese still fought with courage, still drew blood, but the balance had shifted. As one veteran of VMF 124 remarked decades later at the 1985 Pacific Theatre reunion in Hawaii, "The first time I saw a Zero try to follow me into the climb and fall away, I knew the war had changed. We could finally look them in the eye and know we had the better machine. The duel was no longer one-sided. The Corsair had arrived, and with it came the beginning of Japan's long descent from aerial supremacy. By early 1944, the Pacific War had entered its decisive phase. The Solomons were no longer the contested no-man's land they had been in 1942 and 1943. The Allies had seized momentum, pushing ever closer to the Japanese homeland through a series of island-hopping offensives. And with each new airfield carved out of coral and jungle, the Vought F4U Corsair extended its reach. What had begun in the Solomons as scattered clashes against Zeros matured into sustained dominance. Over the Marianas and the Philippines, the Corsair proved not only that it could match Japan's once-feared fighter, but that it had become the premier American naval aircraft of the war, capable of dueling, diving, bombing, and returning home when others could not. In June 1944, the U.S. Navy launched Operation Forager, the invasion of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. It was a campaign designed to seize airfields from which the new B-29 superfortress could strike the Japanese home islands. The stakes were nothing less than strategic. By this time, Marine and Navy Corsair squadrons had been operating intensively across the South Pacific, refining tactics and building experience. VMF 214, the famous Black Sheep, led by Major Gregory Pappy Boyington, had shown what the bent-wing bird could do against skilled opponents. Squadrons like VMF 111 and VMF 216 carried forward that legacy into the Central Pacific thrust. Japanese planners knew the importance of the Marianas. The combined fleet, battered but still dangerous, gambled everything on what would become the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Though Hellcats bore the brunt of the action, Corsairs played a vital role in land-based strikes, ground attack, and air superiority sweeps. The key to the Corsairs' growing dominance lay in its ability to operate at altitudes where the Zero faltered. Marine after-action reports from the Marianas consistently highlight engagements beginning above 25,000 feet. One such report from VMF 216 dated July 1944. Zeros attempted to climb into intercept position but stalled out near 23,000 feet. Corsairs continued upward with minimal effort, initiating attack runs from superior position. Enemy displayed hesitation in pressing engagements beyond initial climb. Japanese testimony confirms this frustration. In an interrogation after the war, Lieutenant Haruo Araki, a veteran Zero pilot, admitted, "By 1944, we could not follow the Corsair into the climb. Our engines gasped. We tried to bait them into turning contests at lower altitude, but the Americans no longer accepted. It was like striking at shadows above us. The psychological blow was severe. The A6M, once the unrivaled master of vertical maneuver, had been eclipsed. The Corsair and its stablemate, the Hellcat, fought the way Americans wanted, on terms dictated by horsepower and altitude. The Corsair's ascendance was cemented in the Philippines campaign. By late 1944, American carrier task forces had swept into Leyte Gulf, triggering the largest naval battle in history. Corsairs, now operating from both carriers and advanced airfields, played dual roles: interceptors by day, fighter bombers by dusk. One combat diary from VMF 115, stationed at Peleliu and later in the Philippines, describes the transformation vividly. "We took off to meet Zeros at 20,000 feet. Instead of dueling, we went straight through them, diving, firing, and climbing out. They spun after us but never reached our tails. Later that day, we loaded bombs and returned to smash shipping in Ormoc Bay. The Corsair did both with ease. It feels as if no job is beyond her. The Zero's weaknesses, poor protection, fragile structure, and underpowered engine, were magnified against the Corsair's versatility. For Japanese pilots, every engagement seemed tilted. Even when they caught Corsairs at lower altitude, American armor meant that a burst of 7.7 mm or even 20 mm fire often failed to bring the fighter down. Meanwhile, the Corsair's 6.50 caliber Brownings shredded Zeros with devastating efficiency. Statistics underline the transformation. According to the U.S. Navy's official post-war records, Corsair units achieved an 11-to-1 kill ratio in 1944. In the Philippines campaign alone, Corsairs were credited with destroying over 500 Japanese aircraft for fewer than 50 losses in air combat. Japanese loss records, as compiled by the Allied Translator and Interpreter Section, corroborate the steep attrition. Between October and December 1944, the 201st and 203rd Air Groups reported aircraft loss rates approaching 70%. The once vaunted Zero was being slaughtered in the skies. A 13th Fighter Command summary put it bluntly: "The enemy's reliance on outdated fighters, though flown with determination, has resulted in catastrophic losses. The F4U is now recognized as one of the most effective aerial weapons in the Pacific." Captured diaries paint a poignant picture of the realization among Japanese aviators. Ensign Takao Kudo, who flew with the 201st Air Group in late 1944, wrote, "The enemy planes are heavier, faster, and climb higher. We are told to fight bravely, but bravery cannot reach them. The Corsair looks ungainly, but it rises into the clouds like thunder. Our young men do not return." Another, from Lieutenant Osamu Hara, was more blunt. "The Zero is finished. We still fly, but it is like charging horses against tanks." Such words reveal the collapse of the Zero's mythos. Once seen as invincible, it now represented obsolescence, an outdated weapon fielded by a nation being outbuilt and outpaced. American Corsair pilots, looking back decades later, often recalled the surreal shift. At the 1985 Pacific Theatre Veterans Reunion in Hawaii, Marine ace Ken Walsh reflected, "By the time we hit the Marianas and the Philippines, the fight had changed. The Zero could still kill you if you were careless, but the edge was ours. You could feel it in your bones. We weren't the underdogs anymore. Gregory Boyington, whose Black Sheep squadron had already proven the Corsairs' bite, summed it up more colourfully in an interview before his death in 1988. The Corsair? She was a brute. If you treated her right, she could climb out of hell and take the fight to anyone. The Zeros? By 44, they were just targets waiting to be shot. By the close of 1944, the Corsair had not only surpassed the Zero, it had become a symbol of American aerial supremacy in the Pacific. Its kill ratios, its versatility, and its psychological impact marked a turning point. The Zero's mystique, forged in 1941 and 1942, lay shattered. For Japanese pilots, the sky was no longer a domain of dominance, but a graveyard of vanished hopes. For Americans, especially the Marines who had borne the brunt of the early war, the Corsairs' rise was vindication, a promise that the tide of the Pacific had turned for good. The myth of the Zero had given way to the reality of the Corsair. The bent-wing bird, mocked by some when it first rolled out of Lockheed's hangars, now soared above the Pacific as the master of its domain. By spring 1945, the Pacific War had reached its climax. Iwo Jima had fallen, B-29s were already striking Tokyo, and Okinawa, the last stepping stone to Japan, became the bloodiest campaign of the Pacific. In the skies, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero, once the terror of the Pacific, faced its final trial against the Vought F4U Corsair, the bent-wing brute that symbolized American industrial and tactical supremacy. The Zero still flew in large numbers, but its time had passed. Designed for speed and agility in 1939, it now carried undertrained pilots on missions of desperation, escort for kamikazes, last-ditch interceptions, even suicide dives. Captured diaries reveal the mood. Ensign Hiroshi Yamashita wrote in April 1945, "We fly not for victory but for honor. The enemy machines rise above us like thunder. If we cannot match them, we will at least give our lives." The Zero had become not a weapon of supremacy, but of sacrifice. For Marines and Navy aviators, Okinawa was a crucible. Kamikaze raids struck daily, and Corsairs were tasked with intercepting them before they reached the fleet. Squadrons like VMF 312, the checkerboards, and VMF 323 flew hundreds of sorties. Lieutenant Bill Brooks recalled after one desperate day, "The Zero pilots no longer fought to live. They fought only to die." Even then, the machine struggled. Against our climb, our speed, our guns, there was nothing left. Corsairs dove into kamikaze formations, climbed out and returned again, switching roles seamlessly between interceptor and fighter bomber. Few aircraft in the Pacific combined so much power with so much versatility. The statistics told the story. Between April and June 1945, Corsair units destroyed 1,500 Japanese aircraft, many of them Zeros, at minimal cost. Navy records credit the F4U with an overall 11-to-1 kill ratio, and over Okinawa the disparity was even greater. Japanese officers later admitted the futility. Lieutenant Commander Toshio Nakajima told Allied interrogators in 1946, "We sent boys to fight men." They had never learned combat. The Zero was not their salvation, it was their coffin. By August 1945, the Zero was obsolete in every respect. Against Corsairs, Hellcats, P-38s and P-51s, it was hopelessly outclassed. Fuel shortages, poor training and outdated design meant it could no longer dictate the fight. Where once American pilots had feared its agility, now they refused its challenge, fighting instead in climbs and dives where the Corsair reigned supreme. And yet, the Zero's legacy was not erased. It was the fighter that had shocked the world in 1941, forcing the United States to rethink tactics and outbuild Japan in the crucible of total war. The Corsair, by contrast, endured long after the war. Its power and ruggedness carried it into Korea and beyond, making it one of the longest-serving piston-engine fighters in history. For Marines, it became the symbol of a hard-won reversal, the machine that helped claw control of the skies back from Japan. At a 1985 veterans reunion in Hawaii, a Japanese Zero pilot and an American Corsair ace stood beside restored examples of both planes. The Japanese veteran said quietly, "The Zero was our sword. The Corsair was your shield. In the end, the shield endured." The story of the Zero and the Corsair is the story of the Pacific War itself. In 1941, Japanese pilots mocked American aircraft as clumsy and heavy. By 1945, those same skies were dominated by Corsairs climbing higher, diving faster, and dictating the fight. The Zero entered the war as a myth. It ended as a memory. The Corsair entered the war as a question mark. It left as a legend. Over Okinawa, in those last desperate months, the truth was written in smoke. The age of the Zero was finished, and in those final desperate months over Okinawa, the Corsair soared supreme, climbing higher, striking harder, and proving itself undisputed master of the skies.